in you glory, and help us to do so in our study tonight. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, Exodus chapter 1. We're supposed to make Exodus 1, 2, 3, and 4 tonight. So we will try to, I'm doing my best to stay on track. 1, 2, 3, and 4, we will do our best with that. Exodus chapter 1. So we have studied the book of Genesis so far this quarter, and we talked about how the book of Genesis, it seems to me personally, like every book stands on its own, has its own merit, and its own lessons, and things you can pull out of it and learn from, so taken away from any of that. But it seems to me that if you place it in a role in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, its role is to lead us to the story that begins tonight. It is the episodes and events and the people who are necessary to know about to get us to the story that begins with Moses. And if you are one of the children of Israel, which is whom we believe this book was written to, you can understand why, I think, right? This idea of knowing your own history, knowing your own story, and particularly this group of people, this is the beginning of their personal story. Because this people that Moses is writing to they are the people that are found here in the beginning of the book of Exodus that are in captivity and those sorts of things. So all of what we have studied so far has led us up to what we're going to start studying tonight as we dig into the story of Exodus. Okay? Everybody with me on that? Okay. So we are left at the end of Genesis where? What's going on? What has happened? Where does the story end in Genesis? Do what? Death of Joseph, right? So the children of Israel, how many of them are there? 70, right? 70 plus. You've got a family of a father and maybe some wives attached to that, but you've got the 12 sons, a daughter that we know of. You've got the grandsons and some great-grandchildren. But that, it's just kind of still it's a large family, but it's still a fairly contained family that has come out of Canaan down to Egypt, and they have been given a nice place to live, right, where they can take care of their flocks on the outskirts of Egypt over in Goshen. And Jacob has died, Joseph has now died, and that's kind of where we leave the story, right? When you get to the beginning of the book of Exodus, you've got essentially a recap of that. These are the names of the sons who came with Jacob to Egypt. It lists the 12 sons of Jacob here, or at least 11 of them. And it says essentially, the number was 70. Joseph and all his brothers, and all that generation eventually died. So, okay. We're starting with the next, we're kind of turning the page here, is the idea here. So we're starting the next chapter of the story, right? All of the people we've been reading about, they're gone, and that brings us to this next people. And it essentially gives us, if you're thinking of this in kind of movie or storytelling terms, right? What you've got is essentially a prologue to the next story. Let me kind of a introductory chapter that at least is going to advance the story to get us to where we need to be, which is the birth of Moses, right? So we're bridging the gap here at the beginning of Exodus between Genesis and the story of Moses. And essentially, what do we find out in this little prologue? A new king that does not know Joseph for whatever reason. Keith Poe and I have talked several times about what could possibly be the reason for that, and the changing of kings or the amount of time that's passed by, and there are several things that could be possible there. But we've got a stretch of time because we know that there's been Jacob, his sons, and that generation have all died, and then as a result of that, lots more people are born. So we've got some time that passes. We've got some changing of leadership in Egypt that has occurred, which means now Israelites are not giving the favorable treatment that they were getting under the Pharaoh of Genesis, right? What else? What else is happening? Dallas? Okay. I don't know that he and I discussed that, but would you like to explain that? Secular history, yeah. Yeah. So what we've got is, and again, this depends a lot on, without getting into the weeds here, it depends a lot on where you place the Exodus story in the history of Egypt. So it's less about where you place the Exodus story and more about how you understand the history of Egypt, because the history of Egypt is one big, just messy, jumbled up history. When you start looking at, and I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this, if you look up a story, kind of a timeline of Egypt's history, just go ahead and tear it out of the book and throw it away, because we do not know enough about the history of Egypt. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is, multiple times through their history, there was more than one dynasty in power at the same time. So it depends on which dynasty you're giving your attention to. So there might be where the river is, and you've got all of these different understandings. Right now, we've got these nice dividing lines, border lines of Egypt on North Africa. Back then, they didn't. Back then, Egypt was more sprawling. There was more area that was constantly coming in and out of Egypt's control. So you've got a lot of that kind of stuff that's going on. Secondly, and we've talked about this before, Egypt had an understanding that if you wrote something down, it would come true in the afterlife. Okay? So, are you going to write bad things down? No, because that would mean that those bad things would take place in the afterlife. And so you've got a very biased and incomplete history at the same time that you've got a lot of variation in who's in control and who's writing down the records and all of that sort of stuff. Then on top of that, we just have only found so much. Right? We piece together puzzle, but we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, right? And that can make putting the puzzle together pretty difficult. And so Dallas is absolutely right. So one of the theories is the reason we've got this transfer of leadership and lack of knowledge is because there have been, and the Ixos weren't the only ones, there have been different groups that would come in and take over Egypt that weren't Egyptians. So the Egyptians, we know they had a very big bias against foreigners, right? We read that back in Genesis. The Ixos, the foreigners, didn't. So that's one of the reasons people assume that maybe this was the issue. The Egyptians would not have wanted the Israelites in their cities because they were dirty foreigners. The Ixos don't care. They are also foreigners. So they'll make slaves out of anybody, right? Including other Egypt, or the actual Egyptian. And so you run into a lot of that kind of, it could be this, it could be that. It depends on, even the succession of pharaohs is a big jumbled mess when you go back and look at Egypt's history. Some people try to make a big deal about there was a particular pharaoh that was monotheistic, and maybe that was the pharaoh of that Joseph had taught him to be monotheistic. Problem is the timelines don't match up. But the problem with that is we don't know if the timelines match up because we don't actually trust the Egyptian timeline. So again, there's a lot of assumptions and just doing your best to piece it all together. Okay, and so that makes a difference in the way that you try to piece together how the history all matches up. I tend to just side with there is a much clearer picture of their history in the Bible than there is carved in stone. And I'm going to trust the Bible. So, I do know that these events happen. Which Pharaoh is this new king? I have no idea. And it is a guess any way you go with that. Keith? Well, and I would imagine not even 4 or 5 generations, probably more like 10 to 12 generations. I mean, there would have been a significant amount of time that needed to pass for them to grow from 70 people keeping flocks on the outskirts of Egypt to verse 9, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. That's a lot, right? And again, depending on which dynasty you're thinking this is talking about, maybe he means Egyptians as a whole, maybe he means just our dynasty. Like what if the real Egyptians get the Israelites to fight on their side and now they are more numerous than we are and they turn everything back over to the Egyptians? That might be what he means. But clearly he's concerned about the number and the strength. So there's been enough time to pass that there's been a dramatic increase in number and strength of the Israelites. And so, come, let's deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so they make them their slaves, they put them to the task of building and making the bricks necessary to build the building, and those types of tasks that you would give to a slave population. And that's the problem that we essentially open up with, that the readers of the book of Exodus are going to go, oh, remember that, right? I mean, this is their direct history that Moses is writing down. And so he is helping them to see what God rescued them from. And that's an important part of the book of Exodus, that God is a rescuer. That's going to be one of the main themes that we're going to come back to and see as we go through this story. God is a rescuer. Keep that in your head, okay? As we keep moving forward, the king decides that he's going to, I also find it interesting that at least in the early part of Exodus 1, he's called the king of Egypt, not the Pharaoh. Now, a little bit later, he's called the Pharaoh. And there's actually even, I think, a theory that the king of Egypt is a different person than the Pharaoh. That what you have here is a split dynasty that has oppressed the Pharaoh, and so they're able to go to the Pharaoh with information that they can't go to the king of Egypt with, and that there's even a split dynasty there represented in the text. I don't know. The Bible's not overly concerned with us understanding that. They probably understood it as the original readers. It's not something we understand now, removed so far from the text, nor does it really matter for the lesson that we're trying to get to. So the king of Egypt says he wants to do what? He wants them to do what? Okay, kill the male children. Okay, when you deliver it, he tells the midwives, apparently a couple of them that are the main ones, says when you deliver a baby, if the baby comes out and it is a male child, throw it in the... Okay? And it's a kind of little intriguing story here about the midwife concoct this story that basically says, Well, they birthed these babies so fast that the babies are out and kind of in the mom's arms before we can even get there. I don't know that that is a true statement here, but that's what they tell the king. And it says, verse 20, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very numerous. Since the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And the implication there is these midwives were barren women who now were blessed with their own families, their own children, and therefore Pharaoh then commanded all his people, you must throw them into the Nile, and that the daughters can live. So he, instead of leaning on the midwives, he leans on the families. This is the command, this is the law, throw them in the Nile. Okay? Interestingly, we've got a man and a woman. What are their names? Amram and Jochebed, okay? Wonderful, wonderful people that we know very little about. But they have a child who is very beautiful, and they decide that they're going to, it's one of the only references in Scripture, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he was very beautiful. One of the only references to someone being beautiful in Scripture where this does not turn out bad. But he got Moses, or this child, who was very beautiful, and she throws him in the river, right? Kind of. Okay? I mean, I've always thought this was kind of funny. She obeyed, kind of, right? I mean, she did put him in the river. After he had been alive for a little while, she waited until she weaned him. And there's, I don't know how old that was that he ended up being, but old, young enough to still fit in a basket. She put him in a basket that was floating, and put him in the river among the reeds. And of course, Miriam, his older sister, stood there and waited to see what would happen. And what happens? Yeah, that's right. So we've got Pharaoh's daughter. So the basket, my guess is strategically placed. Okay, I don't know that. We're not told that. This is one of the supports that people have sometimes for believing that the king of Egypt is different than the Pharaoh. Okay, because if it's the same person and he wants all those male children dead, what is he immediately going to do to this clearly Hebrew child? Kill it. Unless it is a person, and therefore he is more sympathetic to the Israelites. And so when the Israelite comes, you've got this Hebrew baby, he is more sympathetic about letting the child live, and he lets his own daughter raise the child. More than likely, and again, we're not told this, there is some strategic maneuvering involved in some of this. Not only do you have Jochebed or family placing the baby among the reeds, where the baby will be found, or the child will be found, and the child will be adopted or at least found by Pharaoh's daughter. But then you've also got, probably there is a possibility that there is kind of a common thing back in ancient cultures. You see this in the book of Daniel. Why does Nebuchadnezzar take all the young men from Israel into his own house? He took the smart ones that could serve. You ever thought about why? He's raising up governors for people he had control over. And the idea is, if I can get one of to me, there's a bit of political maneuvering going on there. And I kind of wonder, we don't, again, a lot of unstated facts in this story. There seems to be some awareness of Pharaoh's daughter, that there would be some sort of sympathy here, which makes me assume maybe they had some dealings with Pharaoh's family so that they knew that this would be something that could work out. Maybe it is all by chance and providence in the way God worked it out. It very well could be. That's perfectly fine if that's the the way you interpret the story. But I kind of wonder if there's not some intentionality in what is happening here. And that, maybe God told them this is the right way to do it, and we're just not told about that. Maybe they've overheard things in their dealings with Pharaoh's family. Who knows? For whatever reason, somehow God works it out that Moses survives. He is raised in Pharaoh's house by Pharaoh's daughter. He is educated. He learns all the things that a royal man from Egypt would have learned. He learns about their medical techniques. He learns about their political techniques. He learns about probably the reading and the writing and documents and how all of that works. Okay? He is an educated man. We're told in Acts chapter, educated in all the ways that we would expect a man who grew up in Pharaoh's house to be educated. That's important because God's choosing a man to lead his people who's going to be able to write the Pentateuch. If you haven't thought about that, this sets up the possibility for us to even have this story written down. So that's a pretty cool thing. But secondly, I think it sets up for us this idea of again, I think Moses is helping the people to see God has been very intentional through all of this. God started rescuing you 80 years before he rescued you. Right? Is that not important? Especially if you're a people who are wandering through the wilderness because of your sin, because you did not believe that God would be able to take you into the promised land and defeat the people who were there. And you needed to know that God can indeed do that. That God has worked this out for decades before any of it actually happened. Do you think that would have given some strength to some people who are like, 20 more years of wondering? Well, but maybe God's preparing the way, God worked ahead of time before. Those kind of things can be helpful to learn. And so, again, Moses comes into that house, he's raised, he's educated, he's given all the things he needs to have in order to be I think, personally, a leader who is both loyal to his people and loyal to Pharaoh. Now, that ends up not being the way it happens because about 40 years into Moses' life, what does he do? What's he see? Do what? At the end of the first 40, when he's 40 years old, what does he see? Okay, an Egyptian abusing an Israelite, right? So what does Moses do? Okay, yeah, I mean, he basically takes it into his own hands, and he decides he's going to deal with this. I do find it interesting, verse 11, it's chapter 2, verse 11. Years later, we know it's 40 years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking around, he saw no one, and he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. So, what's the implication here? What's he doing? Do what? Okay, protecting his brother, but he could have protected without killing someone. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he does cover. I mean, it does seem interesting that he is surprised the next day that anybody knew. And if had he done it while there were witnesses, do what? I don't know. And again, apparently he's not really observant of that person hiding over there behind the sand dune. It's but again, it's it is interesting that he is taking matters into his own hands. right? He does think that this is worth killing somebody, and he does actually end up killing this person, and then ends up trying to cover it up and make sure that it's not going to come back and be a problem. But then he ends up not ends up being found out. A couple of other passages. Hebrews chapter 11, which I know y'all just got through. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24. I'll wait till y'all get there. Hebrews 11. Somebody read verse 24 and 24 through 26. Okay, so what does this say is Moses' motivation in this particular event? Do what? He wants to be with his people, which means he also feels not just an identification with his people, but he feels a connection with his people, and he doesn't want them to continue suffering, right? What'd you say, Steve? Yeah. Okay, now Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. Somebody read verse 23 through 25. Acts 7, 23 through 25. Okay, so this goes back to what Steve proposed earlier. He is avenging his brother. So it's very likely that he hunts the Egyptian down and does it in a private manner. But what is his motivation for doing it, according to Stephen? Do what? Deliverance. He understands he's in the prime position to be the deliverer of his people. Not a ruler who is in subjection to Egypt, but the one who is going to rescue them out of Egypt. Right? That's his goal in going down to meet with his people, when going down to cast his lot with his people. That's his goal. He is going to get them out of this. Okay? And what's their reaction to him back in Exodus 2? Who appointed you? Okay, this isn't your job. We're not here to follow you. And so again, this you can imagine how difficult that would be. I mean, he's 40 years old. He's always been the one of authority of some sort, I would assume. And he's being rejected by his own people, even though he's trying to do the right thing and do a good thing by them. Right? He's not trying to make their life more difficult. He's trying to make their life better. And they don't want it. They don't want to have anything to do with him. Part of what we don't know in this story is how much do they actually know about him. I would assume they know who he is. I would assume they know who his brother and his sister and his family are. We know his brother and his sister are still around because they leave Egypt with them. We don't really know much about his parents, but I would assume there's been some sort of interaction in that 40 years. But are the people feeling the connection that he is the one who can kind of lead them out of their oppression? No, not at all. And so he runs. There's always an interesting little tidbit here when you look at the story. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this, back in Exodus 2, when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. I can't remember if it's Acts 7 or Hebrews that says that he did not leave because of fear. Is that Hebrews? Okay, Hebrews 11, you turn back there. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. So there has to be some sort of motivation that causes Moses to run that is not fear. Okay? My personal take, since we're not told, is it has more to do with rejection and failure than it does fear. Okay? He has failed. He thought, here's the time. This is it. Time to go. Let's go. Fight the Egyptians. Let's get out of here. And his own people reject him. When he realizes they're not going to follow him, he leaves. Okay? And just got kind of, this is not going the way I expected it to go. We know he runs. Where does he run to? Midian. Very good. There he sees a dispute by the wells. He solves that, rescues the lady. The lady ends up being the daughter of Jethro / Reuel / I think there's a third name in there somewhere for this man. But he ends up marrying, getting Zipporah as his wife from this high priest of Midian. I would assume, since we're not told high priest of some other god, that this might be the high priest of the God. We're not told that. I don't know. But the fact that there is a Melchizedek who is high priest of God Most High, and then this high priest is there in Midian, maybe he is also of the same God as Moses. We're just not told that detail. Dallas? Yeah, he plays a pretty significant role as you move forward in the story as far as Moses' leadership and the way Moses does things. Again, we're not told that specifically, but the fact that he's not identified with any other god makes me think very strongly that he would have been a high priest of Yahweh. But he ends up marrying Zipporah. And then we come to chapter 3 and 4, which is the story of Moses at the burning bush. We're not going to dig into that in great detail. I do always like to point out the 5 excuses that Moses makes. You've got 5 here that, God basically says, hey, here's what I want you to do. And he goes, yeah. Well, let me ask a couple of questions here. I'm not really sure. But essentially what he asks here, I think I've preached on this before since I've been here, so I don't want to belabor this point. But basically, he comes toward the burning bush. God says, remove your shoes. You're on holy ground. He does so. God says, this is what I've seen. This is 40 years later, folks. So the Israelites have been suffering for 40 more years. But here God's calling them. I've seen what they're oppressed with. I want to take them back to their land, which is a land flowing with milk and honey. Therefore, I'm sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses' first excuse, there in verse 11, who am I? Okay, who am I that I should go and do this big, important task? And what is God's answer? Always amazed me. The answer is, you're a nobody. That is not the answer we expect to hear. But essentially, God says, you're a nobody, but I'm the one doing this work. Right? So it really doesn't matter who you are. What matters is that I'm the one using you to make this task happen. Aaron? Oh, yeah. Well, what's funny to me about this is I actually see this as a moment of growth. Because 40 years ago, who did he think he was? I'm the somebody who's going to get in there and get this job done. And he was going to do it by whose power? His own. Now he's saying, who am I? There's humility there. That's a good thing. Now, yeah, absolutely. I think God spent 40 years giving him the skills he needed, and then the next 40 years giving him the character he needed. And in doing that, he made a perfect deliverer. Give him the skills, give him the character, now you're ready. And you see that character in the questions, but you also see God get a little bit frustrated by the end of the question. So I do want us to pay attention to that. Dallas? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm clearly not the guy for this job, you know. And God, I mean, again, I love God's answer. You're nobody. God doesn't say that verbatim. But essentially, God's answer here is, I will certainly be with you. That it's me. This isn't about you. This is me. Keith, and then, oh, now I'm having a blank. Joel, I got it. Man, yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes, Joel. Okay. Yes, that this was God's plan for him to do this. Okay. Yeah. At this point, yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's a good correction. We sound to me a lot like mama's words more than God's words of, you know, you're in the perfect position for this, son. This is going to be great. You know, it's I'm completely conjecturing on that, but you know how mamas are. So we've got, who am I? God says nobody. Next question he asked is, if I go, who do I tell him you are? So who am I, and then who are you? And what's God's answer? I am who I am. That's the way it's normally translated. Does anybody have an alternative translation in your side notes or anything? Okay. It could also mean I am whom I intend to be. Okay, so I am what I want to be. Which is, again, not really an answer, but it is an answer. But just that idea of I am God. I'm whatever I want to be. Like I will be everything I need to be for this people. Like that is the the main idea here. So say to the Israelite, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. That idea of, and I love that description, I am the God who has been God as long as that's been there, that's been needed. I am the God of your ancestors. I am the God who has always been. I am the God who has already developed a relationship with you as a people. I am God. And so you've got a lot of different implications and lessons there in those descriptions that God gives about himself. So go and do this job. Moses answers, chapter 4, verse 1, what if they won't listen? What if they will not obey me, but say the Lord did not appear for you this way? So what if the people don't believe? Which again, going back to Aaron's comment earlier, isn't that essentially probably the very thing he's been wrestling with for 40 years? Why didn't they believe me? Why wouldn't they follow when I was clearly on their side? Why wouldn't they trust me? Why, and that struggle there, he's still struggling with this idea of what if they don't believe me? And so what does God do? Gives them signs. So again, essentially, they don't need to believe you, they need to believe God. God is the one delivering them. And so this idea of, here's a couple of signs. No, you're going to go in there and you're going to do some pretty amazing things, and that it's going to work. It's going to work out. Next excuse he gives, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 10. Please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, because my mouth and my tongue are sluggish. So now what his excuse is essentially, I'm unqualified. Okay? I'm not the right man for the job. Right? What's his answer? What's God's answer? Do what? Aaron. But even before that, do what? Yeah, well, and essentially, I'm the one that made your mouth that way. Right? I mean, you say you're unqualified and you're not skilled and you don't have the ability to do this. I'm the one that gave you the abilities. If I didn't think you were qualified, I wouldn't be asking you to do this in the first place. Right? Isn't that essentially the answer? This isn't about whether you think you're qualified or not. The fact that I've asked you to do this in the first place means that you are qualified. I made your mouth that way. But to help you feel better, I'll give you Aaron. Essentially what he says is, you will be my prophet, Aaron will be your prophet. And here's what I've always found interesting. How long did that last? How long did he need Aaron to be in that position? Not long at all. Okay? I mean, he realized he could do the job, that God did make him qualified, that he did have the ability to speak and talk to, to the point to where Aaron almost feels like he's the nobody in the whole ordeal, because he gets jealous of the fact that God always speaks to Moses. God doesn't speak to him and Miriam, right? And so you've got some disputes and difficulties there. But ultimately what it comes down to is what he says there in verse 13. Okay, what's Moses say? Just send somebody else, please. Please just send somebody else. Ultimately what this comes down to is he didn't want to. He didn't want to. And brothers and sisters, dare I make the application that most of the time that's our issue too. We are qualified to do God's work. We are given the skills to do God's work. We are called to do God's work. And when we don't do God's work, even though we might have 101 excuses as to why we didn't do it, when it really comes down to it, we just didn't want to. We're the ones saying, please, Lord, send somebody else. I think we need to be very cautious about that. We can come up with all the reasons. Is that my wife sneezing from that point? Pretty sure I heard. We are capable of doing the work the kingdom needs done. Every single one of us is. We just have to want to. And this is where God gets angry, right? There in verse 14, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And this is where he brings Aaron into it. Fine, I'll give you what you need, but you're going to go do the job. I'll give you what you need. I'll give you what you think you need, but you're going to go do the job. And God does not give him an out, and God makes him go do the job that he doesn't want to do and doesn't really leave him any other choice. So he goes back to Jethro. He tells his father-in-law what's happening. His father-in-law says, go in peace, essentially go do the job God has given you to do, and he decides to go do it. And then we have this short little odd episode about circumcision, right? Moses has not circumcised his sons. Why is that a problem? Sign of the covenant. To be an Israelite, you must be circumcised. Which, and again, I might be reading too much into this, but that means when Moses left Egypt behind, what does it seem he also left behind? The people. He has left the people because he's not raising his children as Israelites. And God's anger is burned against Moses because of this, because here God has called Moses to go lead his people, and yet Moses hasn't led his own family as the people. And so God's ready to kill Moses because of it, before Moses ever even gets back to Egypt. And Zipporah steps in like a good wife tends to do and takes care of the hard part in order to make sure that her husband is in keeping with the will of God. So she circumcises her son, throws the foreskin at Moses' feet, and essentially says, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. She gets angry. And Moses has just gone and made everyone angry. And he has to deal with that. But he gets back, he meets Aaron. They head back into Egypt. Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron repeated everything the Lord had said to Moses and performed the signs before the people. The people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had paid attention to them and that he had seen their misery, they knelt low and worshiped. Now we're going to get a pretty quick glimpse of how fickle the Israelites are, pretty quick in this story. But at least here you've got a kind of a good little wrapping up of this part of the story of Moses is now recognized as the deliverer. So what he tried to do back at 40 years old, willingly, he is now doing unwillingly, kind of put that in quotes, hesitantly, but he is going to be the deliverer of the people.